Breaking news! The conversation around this team has shifted again, and every fan watching right now knows exactly why. When the Eagles hit a rare stretch without a game until Monday Night Football, you finally get a moment to breathe, to look beyond the immediate chaos of the season, and to ask the question that always comes up in Philadelphia: what's next? And when you dig into what's ahead, when you actually break down the upcoming offseason and what this roster is shaping up to become, you realize something very clear. The Eagles are staring at one of the most pivotal draft cycles they've had in years, and every move from here forward has the potential to reshape not just the roster, but the entire direction of this franchise. Because let's be honest, the needs are real, and they're bigger than people outside this fan base want to admit. You look at this offensive line, a unit that used to be a league-wide standard, and you see the wear. You see the snaps where the right guard spot becomes a liability, where Lane Johnson's aging curve can't be ignored, where even dependable pieces like Cam Jurgens, Landon Dickerson, and Jordan Mailata look more worn down than washed. This isn't about blaming players. It's about recognizing that longevity in the trenches is brutal, and the Eagles are now at the point where future-proofing is no longer optional. The offensive line isn't just a need, it's a foundation that needs reinforcement. And then you shift to tight end, where Dallas Goedert's free agency future creates a massive question. Do the Eagles invest big money into a veteran who's been reliable but expensive? Or do they grab a young, dynamic, red zone threat tight end like Keenan Sadiq, a player who looks every bit like the modern prototype, explosive, creative after the catch, a violent blocker, and someone who Mel Kiper says is nearly impossible to match up with because of his size, burst, and quickness? This isn't just a replacement. This could be a long-term offensive building block under team control for years. And we can't ignore the wide receiver storyline, because this one might become the biggest headline of the entire offseason. If the Eagles truly entertain the idea of moving off A.J. Brown, and that possibility alone sends a shockwave through this fan base, the entire draft board shifts. DeVonta Smith becomes your number one, Jahan Dotson likely walks in free agency, and suddenly you're staring at a depth chart that doesn't look anything like the elite unit fans have gotten used to. A player like Denzel Boston starts to make a whole lot of sense. Long, tough at the catch point, highly productive, and blessed with the kind of physicality that can restore the mismatch upside this offense depends on. Again, this isn't guessing. These are the scenarios directly tied to what Philadelphia is evaluating right now. But the defense, man, this is where things get even more interesting. You look at Vic Fangio's system and you know how crucial the right pieces are. Reed Blankenship potentially hitting free agency leaves a massive hole at safety. And then you see a prospect like Caleb Downs, a football savant, a player Mel Kiper describes as practically an extension of the defensive coordinator himself, someone who diagnoses faster than his straight-line speed, someone who's fundamentally reliable and instinctually elite. It's not hyperbole, this is the exact type of player Fangio builds his entire scheme around. And then there's the edge group. The Eagles could add another explosive outside rusher like David Bailey, a relentless, high IQ finisher who has unlocked an entirely new level of production at Texas Tech. Or they could lean into a bigger, more punishing defensive end like Ruben Bain Jr. or Kendrick Falk, both of whom bring size and power that fit the hybrid front the Eagles have been leaning into. These guys don't just pressure quarterbacks, they disrupt entire game plans. And Howie Roseman has never been shy about addressing the trenches early and often. You also look at the cornerback situation. Opposite Quinyon Mitchell, the Eagles could be staring at a huge long-term opening. And that's where names like Avion Terrell and Mansour Delane enter the conversation. Fluid athletes, proven playmakers, instinctive corners who fit Fangio's man-zone hybrid approach. Both would give Philadelphia a young, high-upside pairing to build around for years. And then there's the offensive line again, because you can't talk about this franchise without talking trenches. A player like Vega Ione at right guard, powerful, technically sharp, 0 sacks allowed this year, would give the Eagles a tone setter they simply do not have at that spot right now. Put him under Jeff Stoutland and you might be looking at another long-term anchor. Everything you just heard, every storyline, every roster hole, every draft candidate, is rooted directly in what this organization is evaluating internally right now. And that's why this upcoming draft is so fascinating. This isn't a luxury draft. This isn't retooling for fun. This is positioning the franchise for the next 5 seasons. As fans, you feel that sense of urgency. As journalists covering this team, we see it in every conversation inside the building. It's all pointing toward one pivotal question: and that's exactly where we end this first part. Which of these draft scenarios do you think should be the Eagles' top priority heading into the offseason? Starting right where we left off, because once you step back and look at how many critical decisions the Eagles are facing, you start to understand why this draft cycle has become the centerpiece of every conversation around the team. And the truth is, the deeper you go into the tape and the evaluations from Mel Kiper's board, the more you start to see how dramatically different this roster could look just a year from now. There's no exaggeration here. When you consider the potential losses in free agency, the possibility of big-name departures, and the clear regression in certain position groups, the Eagles aren't simply tweaking the roster, they're lining up for a reshaping that touches every phase of the team. And this is where the pressure rises, because Howie Roseman doesn't have the luxury of missing on a pick, not in this window, not with these stakes, not with this aging core in the trenches. If you focus again on the offensive side, the conversation circles back to stability. Offensive line play has been the identity of this franchise for a decade, but now you're looking at a group that needs reinforcements from multiple angles. Spencer Fanto out of Utah stands out immediately. He hasn't allowed a single sack this season, he's played both tackle spots, and he carries the kind of technique that Jeff Stoutland can sharpen into long-term production. This isn't a project player. This is someone who could step in immediately, learn behind Lane Johnson for a season if necessary, and smoothly transition into the starting role. It's the exact type of succession plan the Eagles normally excel at, but haven't executed in the last 2 draft cycles. And when you pair that with a guard like Vega Ione, who is as powerful as he is consistent, the Eagles could realistically fix the entire right side of their offensive line in one offseason if they choose to go that route. That's rare. That's not something you get in most draft classes. This group actually offers those solutions. But let's shift back to the defensive front because that unit shapes the identity of what Vic Fangio wants to be. He wants versatile players. He wants ends who can move inside. He wants power and length on early downs and speed on passing downs. That's why Ruben Bain Jr. becomes such an intriguing fit. He's active, he's disruptive, he plays with a motor that never stops, and his ability to control the edge on early downs while still generating pressure makes him exactly the type of hybrid piece Fangio can deploy in multiple spots. On the other hand, Kendrick Falk brings that imposing, heavy-handed dominance that Philadelphia hasn't had consistently since the peak of Brandon Graham's interior rotation days. The draft rarely gives you so many scheme-versatile edge options in the same class, so this is the moment where the Eagles can replenish what has slowly faded from their defensive identity since the 2022 Super Bowl run. And then there's the safety position, maybe the most overlooked but arguably one of the most essential in Fangio's system. If Reed Blankenship walks, the Eagles are staring at an empty space in the middle of a field that has to be filled with intelligence, range, and composure. Caleb Downs checks every one of those boxes. The son and brother of former NFL players, he plays with the understanding of someone who has lived the game since birth. His film shows the instincts of a decade-long veteran, and when a defensive coordinator sees that, especially in a flexible scheme like Fangio's, it's almost impossible to ignore. Downs would be more than a replacement. He'd be a tone setter, someone you build the back end around for years. Cornerback remains the other massive piece of the puzzle. With Avion Terrell and Mansour Delane sitting high on Mel Kiper's board, both bring traits that fit exactly what the Eagles need next to Quinyon Mitchell. Terrell's pedigree, consistency in man coverage, and ability to track the ball make him a pairing that instantly elevates the secondary. Delane, meanwhile, thrives in both man and zone, with exceptional ball skills that would give the Eagles a young 1-2 punch that could stabilize the position for the long term. When you remember how often the Eagles have struggled with depth, age, and inconsistency at corner, suddenly the idea of adding a young, technically polished defensive back becomes less of a draft luxury and more of a structural necessity. And then there's the wild card scenario, the one everyone whispers about but few want to say out loud. What happens if the Eagles do trade A.J. Brown? The moment that happens, wide receiver goes from a secondary need to a flashing red priority. That's where someone like Denzel Boston steps in. His size, his physicality, his ability to box out defenders and win in the red zone make him one of the few players in this class who can legitimately replace the physical presence the Eagles would lose. You wouldn't be asking him to be A.J. Brown, you'd be asking him to maintain what Brown's style brings to the offense, and that alone makes him an extremely realistic target if that scenario unfolds. This is the landscape the team is navigating right now. Multiple needs, limited margin for error, and a draft board stocked with players who fit exactly what the Eagles require to stay competitive not just next season, but for the next era of the franchise. And when you take all of this into account, the question becomes less about who should they draft, and more about which direction do they want this team to become. Before we wrap this up, I want to hear from you. Which of these paths do you think truly sets the Eagles up for the strongest future? And if you were sitting in Howie Roseman's seat right now, what would be your strategy heading into this critical draft cycle? Let me know your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video, and check out the videos now on your screen for even more Eagles breakdowns. Picking up right from where we left off, because once you dig into how many directions this front office can take, you realize the stakes aren't just high, they're defining. The reality is that the Eagles aren't building for a one-year bounce back. They're building for the next chapter of the franchise, and every decision in this draft will either speed up that transition or drag it out. And with the amount of roster turnover looming, the Eagles don't just need good picks, they need impact pieces who fit exactly what this team is trying to become. And that's why the trenches keep coming back into focus. If this team wants to regain the physical identity that carried them through their strongest years, then offensive line and defensive line have to be the heartbeat of this draft. When you consider someone like Spencer Fado stepping in at tackle, or Vega Ione fortifying the interior, you're talking about players who don't just plug holes. They allow the Eagles to rebuild their offensive line the same way they once transformed it into the league's best. And more importantly, those players reset the tone. They make the offense tougher. They give the quarterback more time. They restore what made this team impossible to push around. And that kind of impact doesn't show up in highlight clips, but it shows up every Sunday in the fourth quarter when the game comes down to who can move the line of scrimmage. But the defensive rebuild is just as layered and just as urgent. Vic Fangio's system is at its best when he has interchangeable pieces, power on early downs, speed on passing downs, and intelligence on the back end. A rotation built around someone like Reuben Bain Jr., with his relentless energy and disruptive presence, paired with a massive, imposing body like Kendrick Falk, would give the Eagles the flexibility they're currently missing. These aren't just pass rushers. These are players who force offenses to change their blocking schemes. These are players who tilt protections. These are players who make quarterbacks uncomfortable before the snap even happens. That's the type of defensive front that turns a good unit into a dominant one. And then there's the secondary, an area that could undergo the biggest transformation of all. If the Eagles land a corner like Avion Terrell, who already looks like a polished pro in man coverage, or Mansour Delane, whose instincts and ball production jump off every piece of tape, the defense suddenly gains something it hasn't had consistently in years: stability. Pairing either of those players with Quinyon Mitchell gives the Eagles a young, fast, ball-tracking duo that can actually survive in today's league, where quarterbacks throw 40 times a game and explosive plays happen on every drive. And if you drop a safety like Caleb Downs behind them, someone who plays as if he's been running NFL defenses his entire life, suddenly the entire back end transforms from a weakness into a strength. Then you look back at the offensive skill positions, because the conversation doesn't end without acknowledging the elephant in the room. A.J. Brown's future is a storyline that cannot be ignored. If the Eagles move on, willingly or not, a player like Denzel Boston becomes more than a draft target. He becomes part of the identity shift. Boston brings size, toughness, red zone dominance, and that same bully ball mentality the offense would lose without Brown. He's the kind of wideout who doesn't just run routes, he imposes himself physically at the point of attack. And when you combine him with DeVonta Smith, suddenly you're not rebuilding a receiving core, you're reshaping it with a new profile. All of this leads to the one truth that stands above everything else: the Eagles cannot afford to get this draft wrong. They're entering an offseason where several long-time pillars may be gone, where the trenches need reinforcements, where the secondary needs youth, and where the offense might have to replace one of its most dominant players. But the draft class they're staring at, it fits their needs better than almost any class in recent memory. That's the opportunity. That's the moment. And that's exactly why this fan base is watching so closely, because everyone can feel what's at stake. So now it's your turn. After seeing the full landscape of what the Eagles could do, the offensive line rebuild, the defensive front reload, the potential reshaping of the secondary, even the possibility of replacing A.J. Brown, what direction do you believe sets this team up for the strongest long-term success? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, hit subscribe, and check out the videos now appearing on your screen for more Eagles coverage. And continuing from exactly where we left off, because the picture only gets more layered the deeper you go. What makes this moment so fascinating for the Eagles isn't just the volume of needs or the number of players who fit those needs, it's the timing. This team is sitting at the crossroads of two eras, one defined by the veterans who built the Super Bowl run, and another defined by the young core that's emerging but still needs supporting pieces to truly take over. And that's why the 2026 draft cycle, built around the players highlighted in the file, feels like the hinge point that will determine whether this franchise reloads or resets. Take the offensive line, the soul of every great Eagles team. Fans know the truth. When the offensive line is dominant, everything else in this franchise works. The quarterback plays cleaner. The run game becomes a weapon. The offense controls tempo. But when the line is inconsistent, worn down, or thin, everything starts to feel harder. That's exactly why someone like Spencer Fano becomes more than just another tackle. He becomes part of the long-term arc of the team. A young tackle who's already proven he can protect both sides, already shown he can limit sacks at a high level, and already carries traits that Jeff Stoutland can maximize. That's the kind of pick that stabilizes an entire offense for years. Pair that with a true mauler like Vega Ione at right guard, someone who hasn't allowed a sack all season and plays with power that jumps off the tape, and you suddenly regain the identity that slipped this past year. It's not glamorous, but it wins football games. And then there's the other side of the trenches, the side that used to terrify opposing quarterbacks. The Eagles' defensive line once dictated games. Now, with aging veterans and inconsistent pressure, it needs an infusion of youth and violence. That's why players like Ruben Bain Jr. and Kendrick Falk feel so essential. Bain gives you disruption from every alignment, the short area explosiveness, the relentless motor, the ability to win with technique or effort. Falk gives you raw power, elite size, and the kind of physical presence offenses can't ignore. These two represent the future of the defensive front, and in a Fangio system that leans heavily on versatility, their flexibility becomes even more valuable. When a coordinator can move his ends inside, shift fronts, disguise pressure, and keep his personnel unpredictable, the defense becomes far more than the sum of its parts. But beyond the lines, the structure of the defense hinges on the secondary, and this is where the Eagles could make their most transformative move. Quinyon Mitchell gives them one young cornerstone, but the other outside spot, the future at safety, those are voids that could define the next era of the defense. Avion Terrell, with his polished man coverage, fluid transitions, and ball tracking, fits the mold of a true CB2 who could grow into even more. Mansour Delane brings that technician's mindset, smooth in man, smart in zone, and productive in every season of his college career. Put either of them opposite Mitchell, and suddenly the Eagles shift from patchwork secondary to a young, ascending unit. But the real crown jewel of this conversation is Caleb Downs. And it's not because anyone is promising he'll become a Dawkins or a Jenkins, it's because everything about his profile screams culture piece. He's instinctual, football smart, composed, and able to quarterback the defense from the deep middle. His understanding of schemes, his ability to read offenses pre-snap, and his reliability in open field tackling make him the kind of player Fangio builds the entire back end around. If the Eagles land Downs, they don't just fill a position, they reshape the identity of their secondary for the next decade. And yes, the offensive skill positions are still looming over every conversation, because if the Eagles do move away from A.J. Brown, everything changes. Denzel Boston becomes less of an optional luxury and more of a strategic necessity. His frame, his physicality at the catch point, his red zone dominance, these traits directly mirror the style of receiver the Eagles would lose. And in a league where winning on the perimeter dictates how defenses play you, replacing that element becomes non-negotiable. That's the reality of this moment for the Eagles. Every choice they make is connected. If the offense